The abandoned station wagon sat alone on Mountain Pass Road, its doors hanging open like desperate mouths gasping for air. Snow collected on the seats, covering everything in a pristine white blanket. No footprints led away from the vehicle. No signs of struggle. Nothing to indicate where the Sullivan family, Robert, Linda, and their 3 teenage children had gone. It was as if they had simply evaporated into the howling Montana blizzard of December 1991, leaving behind only an empty car and a mystery that would haunt Pinewood County for decades. Before we dive into this mystery, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think happened. Your opinion could be the key to understanding this story. Just 24 hours earlier, the Sullivans had been the picture of a perfect American family. Robert, a respected environmental scientist, had spent the morning in his home office, poring over water sample data. His wife Linda had been baking her famous cinnamon rolls, the sweet aroma filling their cozy 2-story home with warmth that contrasted with the bitter cold outside. Their oldest daughter, Emily, practiced Christmas carols on the piano, while the twins, Jason and Sarah, argued over whose turn it was to walk their golden retriever, Max. "It's going to be a bad one," Robert had said that evening, watching through the living room window as the first heavy snowflakes began to fall. The weathered lines around his eyes deepened as he frowned at the darkening sky. "They're saying it could be the worst storm in 50 years. Linda placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, sensing the tension that had been building in him for weeks. "We'll be fine," she assured him, though her voice carried a slight tremor that their youngest, Sarah, didn't miss. "Dad, are you worried about something?" Sarah asked, looking up from her homework spread across the dining room table. The lamp above cast shadows that seemed to dance nervously across her face. Robert forced a smile. "Just the weather, sweetheart." But it wasn't just the weather. Those close to the family would later recall subtle changes in Robert's behavior in the weeks leading up to the blizzard. The hushed phone calls, the locked office door, the frequent trips to Emerald Lake where he collected water samples long after his official research project had ended. What none of them knew was that Robert Sullivan had discovered something in those water samples, something that would change everything. The last confirmed sighting of the Sullivan family came from Doris Henderson, the cashier at Mason's General Store, where Linda purchased an unusual amount of supplies the afternoon before the storm hit. "She bought enough food to last weeks," Doris would later tell investigators, the silver bells on her Christmas sweater jingling as she gestured to emphasize her point. "And batteries. Lots of batteries. I remember joking that she was preparing for the apocalypse, not just a snowstorm." Linda had simply smiled in response, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. By the next morning, the blizzard had engulfed Pinewood County in a white fury that made travel impossible. And when the skies finally cleared 3 days later, search parties found only the abandoned station wagon on Mountain Pass Road. But what really happened to the Sullivans that night? Why would a loving family leave the safety of their vehicle in the middle of a deadly blizzard? And what was the real reason behind those water samples Robert had been so secretly collecting? It would take 25 years for the truth to begin emerging from beneath the ice. And when it did, nothing in Pinewood County would ever be the same again. January 2016 arrived in Pinewood County with a vengeance. Temperatures plunged to record lows, and the snowfall was relentless. For Earl Thompson, a veteran snowplow operator with 32 years of experience, it was just another Montana winter, until it wasn't. The morning of January 12th began like any other. Earl's breath formed clouds in the freezing cab of his plow as he navigated the treacherous roads near Emerald Lake, the same roads he'd been clearing for decades. His radio crackled with updates from other operators, and the scrape of the plow against asphalt created a rhythmic soundtrack to his workday. "Something's not right," Earl muttered to himself, feeling an unusual resistance as his plow struck a particularly stubborn patch of ice. The sound wasn't the typical scrape he knew so well. There was a metallic clang that sent vibrations up through the chassis of his vehicle. Curious, Earl stopped the plow and climbed down. the biting wind immediately numbing his exposed face. He trudged through knee-deep snow toward the spot where his blade had made contact. What he found there would change everything. "I almost missed it," Earl would later tell Rebecca Porter, his weathered hands cradling a cup of coffee at the Pinewood Diner. "Just a glint of metal, that's all. But something told me to keep digging." What Earl uncovered from beneath years of ice and compacted snow was a container roughly the size of a bread box, made of stainless steel with a seal so tight that not even decades of Montana winters had compromised its contents. Embossed on the lid was an intricate crest, a pine tree with 3 stars above it, the Sullivan family emblem. Inside the container, preserved as perfectly as the day they were sealed away, were journals, photographs, and most shocking of all, a VHS tape with a label that simply read, "When you find us, play this first." "My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold it," Earl recalled, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I knew right away it had something to do with the Sullivans. That crest, everyone in town knew it. Robert had it custom-made when they built their house back in '85. Earl immediately called Sheriff Monroe, who arrived within the hour, his police cruiser sliding slightly on the icy road as he pulled up beside Earl's snowplow. "I've never seen anything like it," Sheriff Monroe admitted, carefully placing the container in an evidence bag. The sheriff, nearing retirement, had been a deputy during the original investigation into the Sullivan disappearance. "This changes everything we thought we knew about that night." But what neither man could have anticipated was just how deeply this discovery would rock the foundations of their quiet town, or the powerful forces that would soon mobilize to ensure certain secrets remained buried. As news of Earl's discovery spread through Pinewood like wildfire, one resident in particular felt the past hurtling toward her with frightening speed. Rebecca Porter set down her coffee cup with trembling hands as she listened to the morning news bulletin. What if, after all these years of wondering, they were about to discover what really happened to the Sullivans? And, more importantly, what if some people in Pinewood preferred that those answers stayed buried beneath the ice? Rebecca Porter stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, noting how the news about the Sullivan discovery had etched new lines of worry across her face. At 63, she'd settled into the comfortable rhythm of semi-retirement, writing lightweight human interest stories for the Pinewood Gazette, a far cry from the hard-hitting journalism she'd once aspired to. 25 years, she whispered to herself, splashing cold water on her face. The bathroom's fluorescent light buzzed overhead, a sound that had annoyed her for years, but that she'd never bothered to fix, much like her stalled career. Before we continue, I'd like to remind you to subscribe to the channel and leave your theories in the comments. Your insights might shed new light on this unfolding mystery. Rebecca had been a young reporter when the Sullivans disappeared, assigned to cover what everyone assumed was a tragic accident. A family caught in a blizzard, making a fatal error in judgment. Her article, "Local Family Presumed Lost to Winter's Fury," had run on the front page and effectively shaped the narrative that Pinewood accepted for decades. Now, that narrative was crumbling. The phone on her bedside table rang, its shrill tone cutting through her thoughts. It was Harold Jenkins, editor-in-chief of the Gazette and Rebecca's boss for the past 18 years. "You've heard?" he asked without preamble. "About the container?" "Yes," Rebecca replied, already knowing where this conversation was headed. "I need you on this, Beck," Harold said, using the nickname only he was permitted to use. "You covered it back then. You knew the family." What Harold didn't say, what he didn't need to say, was that this could be Rebecca's last chance at the kind of story that defines a career. The weight of the decision pressed down on her as she dressed for the day, pulling on her warmest sweater against the January chill that seemed to penetrate the walls of her small cottage. Taking this story meant potentially reopening old wounds, not just for the community, but for herself. Rebecca had known the Sullivans, particularly Linda, with whom she'd shared a book club and countless cups of tea. The memory of their last conversation, just days before the disappearance, still haunted her. Linda had seemed anxious, distracted, asking Rebecca an odd question. How far would you go to protect your family? At the time, Rebecca had interpreted it as the philosophical musings of a worried mother with teenage children. Now she wondered if it had been something more. A cry for help, perhaps, or even a subtle goodbye. As she drove to the sheriff's office, the town of Pinewood seemed different somehow, as if the very buildings were holding their breath in anticipation. Outside Mason's General Store, now run by Doris Henderson's daughter, a small crowd had gathered, their hushed conversations creating a cloud of speculation that hung in the frigid air. Sheriff Monroe looked up as Rebecca entered, his expression a mixture of resignation and relief. "Figured you'd be showing up," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his cluttered desk. On a tray between them sat the container Earl had discovered, now partially processed by the department's meager forensic resources. "I need to see the tape," Rebecca stated, her reporter's instinct kicking in despite years of disuse. The sheriff's hesitation was brief but noticeable. "There are people in this town who'd prefer we let sleeping dogs lie, Rebecca." The unspoken question hung between them. After 25 years, did Pinewood really want to know what happened to the Sullivans? And more importantly, was Rebecca prepared for what that truth might cost her? With steady hands that belied her inner turmoil, Rebecca reached for her notebook. "Play the tape, Sheriff. It's time we all knew the truth." The conference room of the Pinewood Sheriff's Office smelled of old coffee and furniture polish. Rebecca sat rigid in a metal folding chair, her notebook open on her lap, pen poised. Sheriff Monroe fiddled with an ancient VCR that had been retrieved from the station's storage room, muttering about technology as he struggled to connect it to the small television. "Ready?" he asked, his finger hovering over the play button. Behind him, Earl Thompson shifted uncomfortably, having insisted on being present for this moment. Rebecca nodded, her throat suddenly dry. The screen flickered to life, static giving way to the image of Linda Sullivan sitting at her dining room table, the same table where Rebecca had shared countless cups of tea. Linda looked tired, her normally perfect hair disheveled, dark circles under her eyes. The timestamp in the corner read December 14th, 1991, 2 days before the blizzard. "If you're watching this, it means someone found our message." Linda's voice was steady, though her hands, clasped tightly in front of her, betrayed her anxiety. "By now, Robert, the children and I have been gone for some time, and Pinewood has likely created its own story about what happened to us." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "We didn't die in that storm," Linda continued, confirming what the container's existence had already suggested. "We left. We had to. Robert discovered something." She glanced over her shoulder, as if afraid of being overheard in her own home. "Something dangerous in Pinewood's water supply. When he took his findings to Northland Mining, they made it clear our family would be in danger if he went public." The room seemed to tilt around Rebecca. Northland Mining, the economic lifeblood of Pinewood for generations, employing half the town and sponsoring everything from Little League teams to the annual Founders' Day celebration. Linda's voice grew stronger. "We've created new lives elsewhere. Please don't try to find us. But the truth about what's in that water needs to come out. Robert left evidence in a place only someone who cares about the truth would look." She leaned closer to the camera, her eyes intense. "Rebecca, if you're watching this, and somehow I know you will be, remember our conversation about Sarah's special place. That's where you'll find what you need." The tape continued for another minute, with Linda explaining that they'd staged their disappearance to look like a tragic accident, abandoning their car during the storm when search efforts would be impossible. The final frame showed Linda reaching toward the camera, her wedding ring catching the light before the screen went dark. Silence descended on the conference room, broken only by the mechanical sound of the tape rewinding. "She mentioned you by name," Sheriff Monroe said finally, turning to Rebecca with narrowed eyes. What did she mean about Sarah's special place? Rebecca's mind raced back through conversations with Linda, searching for the reference. Then it hit her. A casual comment during the book club about Sarah's love for an old treehouse by Emerald Lake. How the girl would go there to write in her journal when family life became too chaotic. "I know where it is," she said quietly, already calculating how quickly she could get there. But another thought struck her simultaneously. If Northland Mining had threatened the Sullivans 25 years ago over water contamination, what would they do now to prevent that information from resurfacing? "This doesn't leave this room," Sheriff Monroe declared, looking from Rebecca to Earl. "Not until we figure out exactly what we're dealing with." But Rebecca knew better than anyone how quickly news traveled in Pinewood, and as she gathered her things to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were already being watched. What secrets had been flowing through Pinewood's water all these years, and how many people had been hurt, or worse, because the truth had remained submerged for so long? Rebecca's boots crunched through the crusty snow as she made her way along the barely visible trail leading to Emerald Lake. The January sun hung low in the sky, offering light but little warmth. She told no one where she was going, not even Harold, who'd called twice since she left the sheriff's office, hungry for details about the tape. "Sarah's special place," Rebecca murmured to herself, scanning the tree line. The Sullivan property had long since been sold, changing hands multiple times over the years. The current owner, Martha Winters, had given Rebecca permission to search the wooded area behind the house, her eyes widening with interest when Rebecca mentioned the Sullivans. "There's been occurrences," Martha had said cryptically, adjusting her cardigan. "Noises in the walls, items moving. I always thought this place might be haunted." Now, pushing through a stand of pine trees, Rebecca caught sight of it. A weather-beaten treehouse nestled in the branches of a massive oak. Though decades had passed, she recognized it instantly from Linda's descriptions. The red-painted ladder, the small window with star-shaped cutouts, the sloped roof now sagging under years of accumulated pine needles and snow. The ladder creaked ominously as Rebecca began to climb, each rung testing her resolve and reminding her of her age. Inside, the treehouse was smaller than she had imagined. A child's domain, with ceilings so low she had to hunch. Dust motes danced in the shafts of winter sunlight streaming through the star-shaped windows. "If I were Robert," she whispered, "where would I hide something?" She ran her hands along the rough wooden walls, feeling for inconsistencies. In the corner, a small bookshelf held moldering volumes, Nancy Drew mysteries and horse stories that Sarah had loved. Rebecca examined each book, finding nothing but childish inscriptions and dog-eared pages. As the afternoon light began to fade, desperation set in. Had she misunderstood Linda's message? Perhaps Sarah's special place meant something else entirely. Sitting back on her heels, Rebecca's elbow knocked against the bookshelf, causing it to shift slightly. The movement revealed a discoloration on the floor beneath, a square outline different from the surrounding wood. Heart pounding, Rebecca pushed the bookshelf further, exposing what was unmistakably a trapdoor. The hinges protested as she lifted it, revealing a small compartment containing a waterproof bag. Inside were a notebook filled with Robert's meticulous handwriting, vials of what appeared to be water samples, and a stack of photographs showing deformed fish from Emerald Lake. The notebook's first page bore a message in bold letters. "To whoever finds this, the truth about Northland Mining and what they've done to our water." Rebecca's hands trembled as she began to read Robert's detailed documentation of elevated levels of mercury, lead, and other toxins in Pinewood's water supply, all traced back to Northland's illegal dumping practices. He'd included dates, locations, and most damning of all, copies of internal company memos acknowledging the contamination and discussing the cost-benefit analysis of cleanup versus potential lawsuits. The final entry, dated December 13, 1991, chilled her to the bone. Received visit from CM today. Not subtle about threats. Said accidents happen, especially to children. Decision made. We leave during the storm. God forgive me for not fighting harder, but I cannot risk my family. CM. Christopher Morris. Rebecca realized. The CEO of Northland Mining in 1991 and father of the current CEO, Daniel Morris. The sound of a branch snapping outside jolted Rebecca from her reading. Quickly, she stuffed everything back into the bag and peered through the star-shaped window. A figure in a dark coat was making their way through the trees toward the treehouse. Rebecca's pulse raced. Had someone followed her? Was it just Martha coming to check on her? Or was it someone who didn't want Robert Sullivan's evidence to see the light of day, even after 25 years? One thing was clear. The Sullivan family hadn't just disappeared. They'd fled for their lives. And now, Rebecca held the very information that had forced them into hiding. What would it cost her to bring that truth to light? And who in Pinewood already knew she was getting close to discovering it? Rebecca's breath caught in her throat as the figure drew nearer to the treehouse. Clutching Robert's evidence to her chest, she frantically scanned the small space for a hiding place or escape route. The only exit was the same ladder she'd climbed up, now blocked by whoever was approaching. The creak of weight on the first rung sent panic shooting through her. Rebecca pressed herself against the far wall, gripping a rusted child's toy shovel, the only potential weapon within reach. A head appeared through the trapdoor entrance. A woman with steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun. Mayor Eleanor Grayson, who had been the Sullivans' next-door neighbor back in 1991. "I thought I might find you here," Eleanor said, pulling herself into the treehouse with surprising agility for a woman in her 70s. Her eyes immediately fixed on the waterproof bag in Rebecca's arms. "So you found it? How did you know?" Rebecca demanded, not lowering the toy shovel. Eleanor smiled tightly. "Because Linda told me you would, eventually." She settled herself cross-legged on the dusty floor, seemingly unbothered by Rebecca's defensive posture. "I saw them leave that night, you know. Loaded up their car when they thought everyone was asleep. Linda made eye contact with me through my kitchen window, and I just nodded. I understood they had their reasons." The revelation stunned Rebecca. "You've known all this time? And you said nothing?" "I knew they left voluntarily. I didn't know why until about a week later, when an envelope arrived at my house." Eleanor reached into her coat and withdrew a yellowed envelope. It contained a letter explaining about the water contamination and asking me to keep an eye out for anyone searching for information they might have left behind. Rebecca slowly lowered the shovel, processing this new information. "Why come forward now?" "Because of this." Eleanor held up her phone, showing a text message. "Container found. Time to act." The timestamp was from just hours ago. "Who sent that?" Rebecca asked. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "It comes from a different number every few years. I think it's them, the Sullivans, keeping tabs on Pinewood." She leaned forward. "But that's not all. For 25 years, I've been collecting data. Water samples, health records, tracking who gets sick in which parts of town." "You continued Robert's work," Rebecca realized. Eleanor nodded. "Someone had to. Northland Mining has controlled this town for generations. They own the hospital board, half the town council, though not the mayor's office thanks to term limits they couldn't manipulate." Her expression hardened. "Do you know how many cases of rare cancers we have in Pinewood? How many children born with developmental issues, all concentrated downstream from their facility?" A new understanding dawned on Rebecca. "That's why you've pushed so hard for the new water treatment plant." "Which Northland has blocked at every turn," Eleanor confirmed. "But with Robert's evidence and my data, we might finally have enough to take them down." She held Rebecca's gaze. "The question is, are you ready to write that story? Because once you start, there's no going back." The weight of the decision pressed on Rebecca's shoulders. This wasn't just a career-defining story anymore. It was about justice for a community that had been poisoned for decades, about vindicating a family who had given up everything to protect their children. "I'll need help," Rebecca said finally. "Access to records, interviews with affected families." "I can provide that," Eleanor assured her. "But we need to move quickly. Northland already knows something's happening. Earl Thompson's phone has been ringing non-stop with calls from Daniel Morris's office." As if on cue, Rebecca's own phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Be careful who you trust. Even walls have ears in Pinewood." The two women looked at each other in the fading light of the treehouse, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. "We should go," Eleanor said, moving toward the exit. "Separately. Meet me at my house in 2 hours. Use the back entrance." As Rebecca watched the mayor descend the ladder and disappear among the trees, questions swirled in her mind. How deep did this conspiracy go? Who else in Pinewood was involved? And most pressing of all, who had sent that warning text? And were they ally or enemy? The evidence bag felt heavier than ever as she began her own descent. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf, now a potential threat in the gathering darkness. Martha Winters had lived in the old Sullivan house for nearly 7 years, longer than any previous owner since the family's disappearance. At 68, the widow had chosen the property for its seclusion and the way the afternoon light filtered through the pine trees surrounding the backyard. A peaceful place to live out her remaining years. But peace had been elusive in recent months. It began with the dreams, vivid images of a teenage girl pointing insistently at the floorboards in the main bedroom. Then came the inexplicable sounds, scratching within the walls, like someone trying to get her attention. Martha had dismissed these occurrences as the overactive imagination of a lonely widow, until the day her wedding photograph inexplicably fell from its place on the mantel, the glass cracking in a pattern that resembled an arrow pointing toward the stairs. "Albert," she whispered to the empty room, addressing her late husband, "are you trying to tell me something?" Albert Winters had worked at Northland Mining for 32 years before succumbing to a rare form of lymphoma that puzzled his doctors. He wasn't the only employee to develop the condition, a fact Martha found curious but not suspicious until now. The evening after Rebecca Porter's visit to search the treehouse, Martha found herself drawn to the master bedroom, her flashlight beam playing across the hardwood floor. For reasons she couldn't articulate, she knelt beside the bed and ran her fingers along the floorboards, feeling for anything unusual. A slight height difference between 2 boards caught her attention. Using a kitchen knife, she carefully pried up the shorter board, revealing a narrow space beneath. Her fingers closed around a small object wrapped in plastic, a USB drive, something that certainly hadn't belonged to the original owners of the house. Martha's hands trembled as she carried it to her laptop in the kitchen. The drive contained a single folder labeled Continued Evidence, with a text file that opened automatically. "If you're reading this, you've found what I hoped someone would eventually discover," the message began. "My name is Olivia Chen, Environmental Inspector for the state of Montana. I was assigned to follow up on anonymous reports of water contamination in Pinewood County in 2011-2013. The evidence I collected is all here. Proof that Northland Mining has continued illegal dumping practices for decades. After the Sullivan incident, Martha scrolled through PDF files of water test results, photographs of discharge pipes leading from the mining facility directly into groundwater sources, and most disturbing of all, a statistical analysis showing cancer clusters in Pinewood that correlated directly with proximity to Northland's operations. The final document was Olivia Chen's resignation letter, citing personal reasons, but with a handwritten note at the bottom. "The truth will come out. I've left copies where they'll eventually be found." Martha sat back, stunned. Albert's illness, his complaints about strange tastes in the water that the company always dismissed. His deterioration had been so rapid, so devastating. Her grief, long dulled by time, surged anew with a fresh dimension. Anger. Had Northland known they were poisoning their workers? Had they chosen profit over human lives? The sound of a car door closing outside jolted Martha from her thoughts. Through the kitchen window, she saw Rebecca Porter getting out of her sedan, heading toward the backyard where the path to the treehouse began. Decision made, Martha grabbed the USB drive and hurried outside, calling Rebecca's name. "I found something," she said, pressing the drive into the journalist's hand. "Something about the water, and Northland, and—" her voice caught. "I think it might explain what happened to my Albert." Rebecca's eyes widened as Martha explained the contents of the drive. "This is exactly what we need," she said. Evidence that the contamination continued long after the Sullivans left. "There's more," Martha added, lowering her voice, though there was no one else around. "Last night, after you left, I received a phone call. No caller ID. A woman's voice asking if I'd found it yet, and saying she'd call back when it was safe." "Did she identify herself?" Rebecca asked. Martha shook her head. "But she knew my name. And she said something odd, that the family sends their regards." "Which family would know me? I've only lived here 7 years." The implication hung in the air between them. Could the Sullivans somehow be orchestrating this from afar, guiding the discovery of evidence they'd hidden throughout their former home? As they stood there, Martha's phone rang in her pocket. Unknown caller. "Should I answer it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca nodded, her reporter's instincts fully engaged. Martha pressed the speaker button. "Hello?" "Mrs. Winters," came a female voice, mature, confident. "My name is Emily Sullivan. I believe you're standing with Rebecca Porter right now. It's time we talked." Rebecca and Martha sat at the kitchen table, the phone between them on speaker mode. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, and the wind whistled through the pine trees surrounding the Sullivan house. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation as Emily Sullivan's voice, clear and confident despite the distance, filled the room. "We've been monitoring Pinewood for 25 years, Emily explained. Not constantly, but enough to know when things change. When people start asking questions." "How?" Rebecca asked, leaning toward the phone. "How could you possibly keep tabs on a town you fled?" There was a soft laugh on the other end of the line. "We established a network before we left, people who agreed to be our eyes and ears. Over the years, some have passed away, others have joined. Mayor Grayson was one of the first." Martha's eyebrows shot up at this revelation, but Rebecca, remembering her encounter with Eleanor in the treehouse, simply nodded. "The container by Emerald Lake was meant to be found eventually," Emily continued. "Dad calculated that particular spot would be eroded by runoff and snowmelt within 20 to 30 years. Earl Thompson finding it was convenient timing." "Convenient how?" Rebecca pressed, her journalist's suspicion flaring. "Because the statute of limitations on Northland's criminal liability was about to expire," Emily said flatly. "And because people in Pinewood are still getting sick. The contamination never stopped. They just got better at hiding it." Martha's hand went to her throat, thinking of Albert. "I've spent the last decade becoming an environmental lawyer," Emily continued. "My brothers both went into medicine. We've been preparing, building cases against companies like Northland all over the country. But Pinewood is personal." The pieces were falling into place for Rebecca. "So you've been coordinating all of this? The text messages? The clues leading to hidden evidence?" "Not just me. All of us. My parents, my brothers. We couldn't come back ourselves. It still wouldn't be safe. But we could leave breadcrumbs for someone brave enough to follow them." "Someone like you, Rebecca," Martha interjected, understanding dawning on her face. "They chose you." "Mom always said you were the only reporter in town who couldn't be bought," Emily confirmed. "She said if anyone would tell our story truthfully, it would be you." Rebecca felt the weight of those words, the responsibility, but also the vindication after years of feeling like her career had amounted to little. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we build the case," Emily said firmly. "Between Dad's original evidence, Mayor Grayson's decades of data collection, and the materials from Inspector Chen that Mrs. Winters found, We have enough to approach the State Environmental Protection Agency and the FBI. But we need a public face for this, someone in Pinewood who can withstand the pressure. When Northland realizes what's happening. The unspoken question hung in the air. Was Rebecca ready to be that person? Before she could respond, headlights swept across the kitchen window, a vehicle pulling into Martha's driveway. The two women froze. "Are you expecting anyone?" Rebecca whispered. Martha shook her head, fear evident in her eyes. "Get somewhere safe," Emily's voice urged from the phone. "Don't confront them. Call Sheriff Monroe. He's not part of our network, but he's a good man." As Rebecca moved to peek through the curtains, a sharp knock came at the front door. Martha jumped, nearly knocking over her teacup. "Mrs. Winters?" called a familiar voice. "It's Daniel Morris from Northland. I heard you had some concerns about your water quality. We'd like to help." Rebecca and Martha exchanged alarmed glances. How had Daniel Morris, CEO of Northland Mining and son of the man who had threatened the Sullivans, known to come here tonight? "Someone's watching us," Rebecca mouthed silently. On the phone, Emily's voice had dropped to a whisper. "The network has been compromised. You need to leave now. Use the back door and head for the old mining trail behind the property. Someone will meet you there." As Daniel knocked again, more insistently this time, Rebecca gathered the evidence: Robert's samples from the treehouse, Olivia Chen's USB drive, and her own notes, into her bag. "What about you?" she asked Martha. The older woman straightened her shoulders, a determined gleam in her eye. "I'll keep him talking. Buy you time. Albert would want me to do this." As Rebecca slipped out the back door into the frigid night, she heard Martha opening the front door, her voice artificially bright as she greeted Daniel Morris. The real question now was who in Pinewood could they still trust, and who had betrayed them to Northland. The mining trail behind Martha's property was little more than a deer path, barely visible under the moonlight filtering through the pine branches. Rebecca's breath formed clouds in the freezing air as she hurried along, stumbling occasionally on exposed roots and rocks. The evidence bag thumped against her hip with each step, a physical reminder of what was at stake. Who would be waiting for her? Another member of the Sullivans' mysterious network? Or was this a trap designed to isolate her from Martha and any potential help? A figure emerged from the shadows ahead, causing Rebecca to stop abruptly. Tall, female, wearing a knit cap pulled low over her ears. As the person stepped into a patch of moonlight, Rebecca gasped. "Hello, Mom," said Allison Porter, her voice carefully neutral. Rebecca hadn't seen her daughter in nearly 3 years, not since Allison had accepted an environmental law position in Seattle. A deliberate move. Rebecca had always believed to put distance between them after decades of a strained relationship. "Allison? What are you doing here?" Rebecca fought the urge to reach out and touch her daughter, to confirm she wasn't hallucinating. "I got a call," Allison replied, gesturing for Rebecca to follow her deeper into the woods. "From Emily Sullivan. We've been working together for years, though I never knew her real name until recently." Rebecca struggled to process this information as they walked. "You're part of their network? For how long?" "Since law school," Allison said matter-of-factly. "I specialized in environmental law because of what happened here, because of what you told me about the Sullivan case when I was a kid. It always bothered me that you dropped it, that you let them get away with it." The accusation stung, but Rebecca couldn't deny its truth. After the initial articles about the family's disappearance, she'd allowed the story to fade, accepting the common narrative that they had perished in the storm. "I didn't know," Rebecca said quietly. "I didn't have the evidence." "You didn't look hard enough," Allison cut in, then sighed. "But that's the past. Right now, we need to get you and that evidence somewhere safe." They reached a small clearing where a gray SUV with rental plates waited, its engine running. "The plan was always to bring you in, eventually," Allison explained as they got into the vehicle. "Emily has been building a multi-state case against Northland's parent company for years. Pinewood is just one of dozens of communities they've contaminated. But it's the linchpin, the place where the pattern started. As they drove through back roads to avoid the main streets of Pinewood, Allison outlined the legal strategy she and Emily had developed. Using the evidence from Robert Sullivan, Eleanor Grayson, and Olivia Chen to secure federal intervention, while simultaneously pursuing civil cases for affected residents like Martha Winters. "We need your story in the Gazette as the catalyst," Allison concluded. "Something so publicly damning that they can't bury it or buy it off." Rebecca glanced at her daughter's profile, illuminated intermittently by passing streetlights. "Why didn't you tell me you were involved in all this?" Allison's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Would you have believed me? Or would you have dismissed it as another of my crusades?" The old hurt was evident in her voice. "You always chose your career over everything else, Mom. Over me. Over the truth about Pinewood. I needed to know whose side you'd be on when the moment came." The words landed like physical blows. Rebecca had always told herself she was dedicated to journalism, to truth. But had she actually been dedicated to comfort? To safety? Had she backed away from the Sullivan story all those years ago, not because of lack of evidence, but because of fear? "I'm on the side of the truth," Rebecca said finally. "Whatever it costs." Allison nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Good, because once we get to Eleanor's house, you're going to meet someone else. Someone who's been waiting a very long time to talk to you." "Who?" Rebecca asked, though something in her already knew the answer. "Sarah Sullivan," Allison replied, turning the car onto the long driveway leading to the mayor's secluded home. "She's been in Pinewood for 3 days, gathering the final pieces we need. And she has quite a story to tell you." Mayor Eleanor Grayson's house sat at the end of a long, winding driveway, sheltered from view by ancient pine trees and strategic landscaping, a home designed for a public figure who valued privacy. As Allison parked the SUV behind the garage, Rebecca noticed the absence of lights in the windows despite the late hour. "Security precaution," Allison explained, catching her mother's concerned glance. "Eleanor keeps the house dark when visitors arrive. There are blackout curtains on all the windows." Inside, the house was warm and dimly lit by table lamps with low wattage bulbs. Eleanor greeted them in the foyer, her earlier composure now tinged with obvious tension. "Martha called," she said without preamble. Daniel Morris left after about 20 minutes. She told him she was just concerned about some rust in her pipes. Nothing more. She doesn't think he suspected anything, but she's staying with her sister tonight. Just to be safe. Rebecca nodded, relieved that Martha was out of immediate danger. "She's in the study," Eleanor continued, leading them down a hallway lined with historical photographs of Pinewood. "She's been waiting a long time for this." The study door was ajar, warm light spilling into the hallway. As Eleanor pushed it open fully, Rebecca found herself face to face with a woman in her early 40s who bore an unmistakable resemblance to Linda Sullivan. Same high cheekbones, same determined set of the jaw, but with eyes that held a wariness that her mother's never had. "Ms. Porter," Sarah Sullivan said, rising from her seat by the fireplace. "Thank you for coming. And for keeping my treehouse secret all these years." Rebecca felt a strange disconnect, reconciling this poised woman with the 13-year-old girl who had vanished in the blizzard of 1991. "You knew about the treehouse? That I knew about it?" Sarah smiled slightly. "Mom told me she'd mentioned it to you. That's why I left my journal there. Not my real one, but one I created specifically with clues. I was 13 and obsessed with Nancy Drew. I thought I was being so clever." "You were," Rebecca assured her. "I found it today, exactly where you left it." Sarah gestured for them to sit. On the coffee table between them lay an assortment of files, photographs, and digital tablets. The command center of what Rebecca was beginning to understand was a sophisticated operation. "I need to explain why I'm here in Pinewood after all these years," Sarah began, her voice steady. "We never intended to return. The risk was too great. But things changed when my father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer last year. Rebecca felt a pang at this news about Robert Sullivan, whom she remembered as a vigorous, passionate man. His dying wish was to see Northland held accountable, Sarah continued. Sanonadsi Seyfit, not just for what they did to our family, but for everyone in Pinewood who's suffered because of their contamination. Dad passed away 2 months ago, but not before helping us finalize this plan. She indicated the materials spread across the table. We have evidence spanning 35 years, documented cases of contamination, internal memos from Northland executives acknowledging the problems and choosing to conceal them, health data showing cancer clusters centered around their facility. And now you need me to write the story, Rebecca concluded. Not just write it, Sarah corrected her. Become part of it. Your name carries weight in this community. Miss Porter, people will believe you in a way they might not believe an outside investigator or a family who abandoned the town. The bluntness of this assessment, that the Sullivans had abandoned Pinewood, hung in the air between them. We didn't want to leave, Sarah said softly, answering Rebecca's unspoken question. We loved this town, but they threatened to hurt us, specifically to hurt the children. Dad couldn't risk it. I understand, Rebecca assured her. But what makes you think it's safe for you to be here now? It isn't, Sarah admitted. But I'm here under an assumed name, and I'll be gone before the story breaks. What matters is getting the evidence to the right people and making sure the story can't be buried this time. Eleanor, who had been quietly observing the exchange, spoke up. Daniel Morris doesn't have the same level of control his father did. The company has faced lawsuits in other communities. The timing is right. And what about the rest of your family? Rebecca asked Sarah. Your mother? Your siblings? Safe, and continuing their work elsewhere, Sarah replied, not elaborating further. For now, it's better you don't know their locations or current names. As the night deepened, they worked through the evidence piece by piece, building what would become the most important story of Rebecca's career. With each document, each photograph, each testimony collected by the Sullivan Network over decades, the truth became clearer. Northland Mining had knowingly poisoned Pinewood for generations, sacrificing human lives for profit. By dawn, Rebecca had the outline of her article, a comprehensive exposé that would rock Pinewood to its foundations and potentially bring down one of the most powerful corporations in Montana. But as the others finally succumbed to exhaustion, Rebecca found herself alone with Sarah in the kitchen, sharing a pot of coffee as the first light of morning filtered through the trees outside. There's something you're not telling me, Rebecca said quietly. Some piece of this story that's still missing. Sarah studied her for a long moment before responding. You're right. There is one more thing, something we discovered only recently. She hesitated, then asked, What do you know about your late husband's work at Northland, Miss Porter? Rebecca's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Jack? What does he have to do with this? Sarah's expression was gentle but resolute. Your husband worked in Northland's accounting department from 1985 until his death in 2004, correct? Yes, but Rebecca set her cup down, struggling to maintain her composure. Jack was just a mid-level accountant. He handled payroll and basic expenses. He wasn't involved in any corporate decisions. Perhaps not knowingly, Sarah agreed, but he had access to financial records that told a very specific story, one that my father needed to complete his evidence. With careful movements, Sarah withdrew a manila folder from her bag and placed it on the kitchen table. Inside were photocopies of financial documents, all bearing Northland Mining letterhead and Jack Porter's signature. These are allocation reports for environmental compliance expenditures, Sarah explained, her tone professional but kind. Or rather, the systematic reduction of those expenditures from 1987 to 1991, coinciding exactly with the increase in contamination my father documented. Rebecca's hands trembled as she examined the papers. Jack's familiar signature appeared on each one, authorizing budget cuts to water treatment facilities, approving the reallocation of safety funds to shareholder dividends. "Jack was helping your father," Rebecca whispered, a statement rather than a question. The realization was dawning on her slowly, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed falling into place. That's why he was always working late during those years. Why he seemed so stressed. Sarah nodded. Dad needed someone on the inside who could access financial records without raising suspicion. Your husband became that person after they met at a town council meeting where water quality concerns were being dismissed. Dad said Jack was horrified when he understood what the numbers really meant. Memories cascaded through Rebecca's mind. Jack's increasingly frequent migraines in those years, his insomnia, the arguments where he'd accused her of being too absorbed in her career to notice what was happening in their own community. She dismissed his concerns as general anxiety, never pressing for details. "The night we disappeared," Sarah continued, "Jack delivered the final set of documents to our house. We have a photograph of him with Dad in our kitchen, time-stamped just hours before the blizzard hit." She slid a faded photograph across the table. Robert Sullivan and Jack Porter standing in the Sullivan kitchen, grim-faced, a folder of documents between them. "Did he know you were planning to leave?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely audible. "Not the specifics," Sarah replied. "Dad thought it was safer for everyone if the details remained with our family. But Jack knew Dad was building a case against Northland, and he was committed to helping." The implications washed over Rebecca like ice water. His heart attack? Jack's death. It wasn't random, was it? Sarah's silence was answer enough. "We can't prove it," she said finally. But 3 other Northland employees who had access to similar information died of natural causes between 2002 and 2005. All after making inquiries about historical environmental compliance records. Rebecca pressed her fingers to her temples, fighting back tears. All these years, she'd believed Jack had died from the stress of his job and their failing marriage. She'd carried the guilt of not being more present, of prioritizing her reporting over their relationship. Never once had she suspected that he was involved in something so much larger, or that he might have been silenced. "Why didn't he tell me?" she whispered. "To protect you," Sarah said simply. "The same reason my parents didn't tell anyone outside our immediate family. Knowledge was dangerous." A new emotion began to rise through Rebecca's grief and shock. Determination, hardening into resolve. Jack had been part of this fight all along, working in silence to expose the truth. Now, decades later, she had the chance to complete what he had helped start. "Derdsatin Freund, I need everything you have about Jack's involvement," Rebecca said, straightening in her chair. "Fi, every document, every connection to Northland's decisions. If they—" She faltered for a moment, then continued, stronger. "If they had anything to do with his death, that's part of this story, too." Sarah studied her carefully. "Are you sure?" Making this personal could complicate how the story is received. "It's always been personal," Rebecca replied. "I just didn't know it until now." As the morning light strengthened outside Eleanor's kitchen window, Rebecca Porter began to rewrite the narrative of her life, her marriage, her career, and now, the most important story she would ever tell. But unbeknownst to the women working in the mayor's house, Daniel Morris was already making calls of his own. The CEO had not been fooled by Martha Winters's explanation, and his suspicions had led him to place the widow under surveillance. The company that had successfully buried the truth for decades was not about to let it surface without a fight. The Pinewood Gazette occupied a modest brick building on Main Street, sandwiched between the town's only coffee shop and a hardware store that had been in the same family for generations. On a normal day, the newsroom buzzed with the quiet energy of a small-town paper. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the antiquated printing press in the back room rumbling to life in the early afternoon. This Thursday morning, however, the atmosphere crackled with tension as Rebecca Porter hunched over her computer, fingers flying across the keyboard. Her article, temporarily saved under the innocuous title Municipal Water Quality Report, had grown to over 5,000 words, a comprehensive account of Northland Mining's decades of environmental crimes, the Sullivan family's forced disappearance, and the network of citizens who had quietly gathered evidence for 25 years. Harold Jenkins paced behind her, occasionally peering over her shoulder at the screen. "This is Pulitzer material, Beck," he murmured, both awe and anxiety in his voice. "But it's also dynamite. Northland employs half the town. Their lawyers will descend on us like locusts." "Let them," Rebecca replied, without looking up. "Every word is backed by evidence. Sarah and Allison are with the State Environmental Protection Agency right now, turning over copies of everything. By the time this hits our front page tomorrow, there will be state investigators at Northland's gates." "And you're sure about including the part about Jack?" Harold asked gently. He'd known Jack Porter well. They'd played poker together monthly for years. Rebecca's hand stilled on the keyboard. "I'm sure. He was part of this from the beginning. His story deserves to be told." Across town, in a sleek glass office overlooking Pinewood's main square, Daniel Morris was also making preparations. 3 lawyers in expensive suits sat across from his desk, reviewing documents with increasingly troubled expressions. "How bad is it?" Morris demanded. The oldest lawyer, gray-haired and grim-faced, looked up. "If even half of what our sources say Porter has is legitimate, we're facing criminal charges, environmental violations, conspiracy, potentially even wrongful death cases stretching back decades." "Then shut it down," Morris ordered. "Whatever it takes, buy the paper, if necessary." "The Gazette is the least of our concerns now," the lawyer countered. "Our sources indicate the Sullivan evidence has already gone to state authorities, and there are rumors of FBI involvement." Morris slammed his fist on the desk, sending a crystal paperweight crashing to the floor. "My father built this company. I will not be the one to see it destroyed by some crusading reporter and a family that abandoned this town 25 years ago." "There may be a way," offered the youngest lawyer, carefully, "not to make the problem disappear entirely, but to mitigate the damage. A preemptive statement, acknowledge historical issues under previous leadership, pledge full cooperation and remediation efforts." "Throw my father under the bus, you mean," Morris said bitterly. The lawyer spread his hands. "Your father is beyond legal consequences. The company and you are not." As these conversations unfolded, Martha Winters sat in Sheriff Monroe's office, describing the late-night visit from Daniel Morris and her subsequent discovery that someone had entered her home while she was staying with her sister. "Nothing obvious was taken," she explained, twisting her wedding ring anxiously. "But things were moved. My computer had been tampered with." Sheriff Monroe's weathered face remained impassive, but concern flickered in his eyes. "Mrs. Winters, I need to ask, are you involved with Rebecca Porter's investigation into Northland Mining?" Martha hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I found evidence in my house, the old Sullivan house. Evidence that suggests my Albert and others died because of what Northland put in our water." The sheriff sighed heavily. "I was afraid of that." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Martha, there's something you need to know. 2 hours ago, I received a call from the state police. They're sending officers to secure the Gazette's offices ahead of some major announcement. Whatever's happening, it's bigger than anything this town has seen in my lifetime." "Is Rebecca safe?" Martha asked urgently. "For now," the sheriff assured her. "But Northland has deep pockets and deeper connections. Until the state authorities physically arrive, I can't guarantee anyone's safety." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I've lived in Pinewood my entire life, served as sheriff for 18 years. I always suspected there was more to the Sullivan disappearance than we were told. But I never had proof." "And now?" Martha prompted. Sheriff Monroe's expression hardened. "Now I'm doing what I should have done years ago. My job, without regard to who signs the checks for half the town. I've stationed deputies outside the Gazette and Mayor Grayson's residence. No one gets in without my approval. As the afternoon wore on, an unusual energy pulsed through Pinewood. Residents noted the increased police presence, the flurry of activity at the Gazette, the closed-door meeting at Town Hall that had been hastily convened by council members with connections to Northland. At Eleanor Grayson's house, Sarah Sullivan prepared to leave town as planned, her rental car packed and ready for the 5-hour drive to the airport, where she would board a flight under her assumed identity. But first, she made one final call on a burner phone. "It's happening," she told the person on the other end. "Rebecca's story runs tomorrow. The evidence is with the authorities." "And Porter?" asked a female voice. Emily Sullivan, hundreds of miles away, but intently focused on Pinewood. "She's stronger than we anticipated," Sarah replied. "Finding out about her husband's involvement didn't break her. It strengthened her resolve." "And what about you? Are you clear to leave?" Sarah glanced out the window at the town she'd last seen as a teenager. "Yes. No one knows I was here except those we trust." She paused. "Should we tell Mom it's finally happening? That Dad's work is going to see the light of day?" There was a moment of silence on the line. "Yes," Emily said finally. "I think after 25 years, she deserves to know the truth is finally coming out." As Sarah ended the call, across town, Rebecca Porter typed the final words of her article, the most important she would ever write. The headline, now changed from its innocuous placeholder, read, "Buried Truths: How Northland Mining Poisoned a Town and Forced a Family to Vanish." With a deep breath, she clicked Save and prepared to change Pinewood forever. Friday morning dawned crisp and clear in Pinewood, the winter sun casting long shadows across fresh snow that had fallen overnight. By 5:30 a.m., the Gazette's ancient printing press was already humming, producing the most significant edition in the paper's 87-year history. Harold Jenkins supervised the process personally, checking each test copy with meticulous care. "Run an extra 1,000, he instructed the press operator. "Seat, we're going to need them." Rebecca hadn't gone home, working through the night to finalize the layout, verify last-minute facts, and coordinate with Allison on the legal implications of publishing. She stood now in the doorway of the press room, watching as her words, and Jack's legacy, and the Sullivan family's truth, took physical form on page after page. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Harold asked, joining her with 2 cups of coffee from the all-night diner across the street. Rebecca accepted the coffee gratefully. "I've been preparing for this day for 25 years. I just didn't know it." By 7:00 a.m., the first bundle of papers arrived at Mason's General Store, where early risers gathered for coffee and gossip. Doris Henderson's daughter, now the proprietor, cut the binding string and gasped audibly as she saw the headline and accompanying photograph. The Sullivan family station wagon, juxtaposed with a recent image of Northland's facility and a graph showing cancer rates in Pinewood compared to national averages. "Oh my God," she whispered, loud enough that several customers looked up from their morning routines. "You all need to see this." At 7:15 a.m., Daniel Morris's secretary placed the paper on his desk with trembling hands. By 7:20, Morris had assembled an emergency conference call with Northland's board of directors and legal team. By 7:30, the company's public relations firm was drafting a statement that walked the impossible line between denial and damage control. At the sheriff's office, Monroe read the article in its entirety, standing by the window where he could watch Main Street. He'd been a deputy when the Sullivans disappeared, had helped search for the family in the aftermath of the blizzard. Now, learning the truth after all these years, he felt a complex mixture of vindication and shame. Vindication that his suspicions had been correct. Shame that he hadn't pushed harder for answers at the time. "Sir?" A young deputy appeared in the doorway. "There's a crowd gathering outside the Gazette, and we just got word that state environmental officials and the FBI are setting up at the county line. They'll be here within the hour." Tell our people to stay calm and maintain order, Monroe instructed. This is going to be a day like no other in Pinewood's history. By mid-morning, Rebecca's article had spread throughout the town like wildfire. Copies changed hands in diners, barbershops, and the high school, where teachers abandoned their lesson plans to discuss the revelations with students, many of whom had family members working at Northland or suffering from the health issues detailed in the exposé. The Gazette's website, typically visited by a few hundred locals per day, crashed repeatedly as traffic surged from across the country. National news outlets began picking up the story, leading with variations of small-town paper breaks, decades-long environmental conspiracy. At 11:42 a.m., a convoy of government vehicles entered Pinewood, splitting into two groups, one heading for Northland's facility, the other for the town hall where evidence would be collected and statements taken. Rebecca watched it all unfold from the Gazette's second-story window, Allison by her side. Neither woman had slept, but adrenaline kept exhaustion at bay. It's to want AIDS. Dad would be proud, Allison said softly, breaking a silence that had stretched between them for hours. Of both of us. Rebecca turned to study her daughter's profile. So like Jack's around the eyes and jawline. I wish I'd known what he was doing. I could have helped. We could have done this together. You're doing it now, Allison pointed out. Maybe that's how it was always meant to be. Their moment of reconciliation was interrupted by Harold calling up the stairs. Rebecca, there's someone here to see you. Standing in the Gazette's modest reception area was Martha Winters, clutching a small wooden box. I found this last night, she explained without preamble, hidden in the attic crawlspace. It has your name on it. The box, crafted of polished oak with a simple brass latch, indeed bore a small brass plate with "For Rebecca Porter, When the Truth Emerges," engraved upon it. With slightly trembling fingers, Rebecca opened it to find a letter and a small velvet pouch. The letter, written in Jack's familiar handwriting, was dated just weeks before his death. Rebecca, if you're reading this, then what Robert Sullivan and I feared has finally come to light. I've hidden copies of key documents throughout Pinewood, in places only someone truly investigating would look. The Sullivans didn't die in that storm. They fled because Robert discovered what Northland was doing to our water, our children, our future. He refused their bribes and they threatened his family. I've been helping gather evidence since '89. I couldn't tell you, not because I didn't trust you, but because I needed to protect you. Northland watches those who ask too many questions. 3 of my colleagues have already died under suspicious circumstances. I don't know how much longer I have. My heart problems began shortly after I accessed certain historical financial records. If something happens to me, know that I love you, and that I believe someday you'll be the one to tell this story. In the pouch is my evidence, a microfilm containing every document I secretly copied. The originals have likely been destroyed by now. Use it to finish what we started. All my love, Jack. Rebecca clutched the letter to her chest, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. All these years, she'd believed Jack had kept secrets because their marriage was failing. The truth that he'd been protecting her, fighting for justice in his own quiet way, rewrote their entire history. Outside, the sounds of Pinewood in upheaval filtered through the windows. Raised voices, car doors slamming, sirens in the distance as the federal investigation began in earnest. But inside the Gazette's reception area, time seemed suspended as Rebecca Porter finally understood the full circle of the story she'd just told, and her own place within it. He knew, she said softly, looking up at Allison and Martha. Jack knew that someday I'd be the one to break this story. He believed in me even when I'd stopped believing in myself. And he was right, Allison affirmed, placing a hand on her mother's shoulder. You did it, Mom. You brought the truth to light. As Rebecca carefully tucked Jack's letter into her pocket, Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, the last communication she would receive from Sarah Sullivan before the younger woman left. Pinewood, for good. Thank you for finishing what our families started. The truth, at last, is free. 6 months after Rebecca Porter's exposé shook Pinewood to its core, the town was irrevocably changed. Northland Mining's facility stood silent, yellow caution tape fluttering in the spring breeze, a stark contrast to the vibrant wildflowers now carpeting the hills surrounding it. The federal investigation had moved with unprecedented speed, fueled by the mountain of evidence compiled by the Sullivan Network over decades. Daniel Morris faced multiple criminal charges, while Northland's parent company had entered a consent decree agreeing to a historic settlement that included a $1 billion cleanup fund for Pinewood and other affected communities. If you found this story as impactful as I did, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and comment your opinion below. Each comment is like a new piece that can help unravel other mysteries like this one. Rebecca sat at her desk in the Gazette, now nationally recognized after winning prestigious journalism awards for the Sullivan story. The paper had expanded, hiring additional reporters to cover the ongoing environmental remediation and community health initiatives. But today, Rebecca wasn't working on a follow-up piece. Instead, she was writing a personal letter, one she never expected to send. "Linda," she began, addressing the woman she hadn't seen in 25 years. "I finally understand why you asked me that question during our last tea together. How far would I go to protect my family? You were trying to tell me, in the only way you could, what you were about to do." Through Sarah, Rebecca had learned that Linda Sullivan was living under an assumed name in a coastal town 3,000 miles from Pinewood. Though the immediate danger had passed, the family had decided to maintain their new identities. Their lives elsewhere were real now, built over decades. Rebecca continued writing, detailing how the story had unfolded, how Jack's involvement had come to light, and how Pinewood was slowly healing from its toxic past. She described the newly established Robert Sullivan Environmental Research Center, funded by the settlement and dedicated to studying long-term effects of industrial contamination. As she wrote, Allison entered the office, hanging her coat on the rack by the door. After years of estrangement, mother and daughter had formed a new relationship, forged in the crucible of their shared purpose. Allison had relocated her environmental law practice to Pinewood, representing residents in ongoing claims against Northland's parent company. "Saint-Fridine." The first test results came back from Emerald Lake, Allison announced, placing a report on Rebecca's desk. "The remediation is working. Water quality has improved by 60% since January." Rebecca smiled, thinking of how Robert Sullivan would have appreciated this data. Scientific proof that healing was possible, even after decades of damage. Across town, Martha Winters stood in what had once been the Sullivans' backyard, now her own, watching as workers installed a memorial bench beside the path leading to Sarah's treehouse. The inscription read simply, "For those who kept the truth alive, 1991-2016. It had been Martha's idea, a way to honor not only the Sullivans, but also Jack Porter and everyone else who had played a part in bringing the truth to light. Mayor Eleanor Grayson, now in her final term, had spearheaded efforts to diversify Pinewood's economy. With Northland gone, the town faced significant economic challenges, but new opportunities were emerging. The Environmental Research Center had brought scientists and academics to the area, while Pinewood's story had attracted documentary filmmakers and journalists, creating an unexpected tourism boost. "We're not just surviving, we're reinventing ourselves," Eleanor had declared at the town meeting the previous evening. "Pinewood will no longer be defined by what was done to us, but by how we recovered and rebuilt." In her office at the Gazette, Rebecca finished her letter to Linda with a simple truth. Your family's courage forced this town to finally face its past. In doing so, you've given Pinewood a future. Some here still don't understand why you had to leave the way you did. but I do. You protected what mattered most, just as Jack tried to protect me. Perhaps one day, when you're ready, you'll come back and see what your sacrifice helped create. She sealed the envelope, knowing that Sarah would ensure it reached Linda's hands. Whether Linda would ever respond remained uncertain, but the connection had been restored. A bridge across 25 years of secrets and silence. As Rebecca prepared to leave for the day, Harold appeared in her doorway. "There's someone here to see you," he said, an odd expression on his face. "Says he's Earl Thompson's nephew. Just moved to town." The man waiting in the reception area was tall and slender, with familiar eyes that triggered an immediate sense of recognition in Rebecca. Not Earl Thompson's nephew at all, but Jason Sullivan, Sarah's twin brother, now in his late 30s. "Ms. Porter," he said quietly, extending his hand, "I hope you don't mind the deception. I thought it best to be careful." "Why are you here?" Rebecca asked, once they were seated in the privacy of her office. "Isn't it still risky for any Sullivan to be in Pinewood?" Jason smiled. Robert's smile, she realized with a pang. Less so now, with the federal presence and Northland dismantled. Besides, I'm here officially. He placed a business card on her desk. Dr. Jason Williams, Environmental Epidemiology. "You're joining the research center," Rebecca realized. He nodded. "Someone needs to study the long-term health impacts on this community to ensure that what happened here never happens again. Who better than someone who understands exactly what's at stake?" "Does your mother know you're here?" Rebecca asked. "It was her idea," Jason replied. "She said it was time for at least one of us to come home, to finish what Dad started, not just by exposing the truth, but by helping Pinewood heal." As they talked, the spring sun began to set over the mountains visible from Rebecca's window. The same mountains the Sullivan family had crossed during the blizzard of 1991, fleeing for their lives, but leaving behind breadcrumbs of truth that had finally led to justice. 25 years later, Rebecca Porter had followed those breadcrumbs, not knowing they would lead her back to herself, to understanding her husband's final act of love, reconnecting with her daughter, and finding purpose in uncovering buried truths. In Pinewood, where a poisoned past had been hidden beneath decades of ice and snow, the thaw had finally come, and with it, the promise of renewal.